Hello, my name's Peter Wayne, and welcome to the Composer Interview Show. The aim of this show is to ask composers questions that other composers would be interested in knowing about. Things like workflows, plugins, synthesizers, instrumentation, and all that good stuff. So let's learn from each other. Enjoy the episode. Okay, so today I have with me Wilbert Roget II, who's worked on a lot of games, most recently known for Mortal Kombat 11, Star Wars Vader Immortal, and Call of Duty World War II. So welcome to the show, Wilbert. It's an honor to have you on.
Oh, thank you. And thanks for having me, Peter. I really appreciate it.
Okay, so I'd like to start today a little bit differently. I'd like to ask about the business side of a freelance composer.
Yeah.
Because it's not something that's often talked about. So things like how do you find work? How do you make sure you always have enough work? Like things like cold calling, networking, following up leads, and also making sure that you're paid well enough to be able to sustain periods of time where you may not have work, especially early on in your career. So I'm interested to know how you sort of balance that, how you manage things, and how you make purchases. Like sample libraries are very expensive, hardware is very expensive. So how have you been able to stay afloat as a freelance composer for so long?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I would first off say that the way you do things at the start of your career can be very different from how you do things later on once you have momentum and whatnot. And I don't even want to say momentum in terms of, I've done this gig, and so surely that'll lead to the next, because it really doesn't. It's more about the people that are behind them, and that's how you kind of hopscotch from one thing to the next. It's not necessarily like I have this credit and now something's bound to happen, right? Mm-hmm. But I would say that at the start of my career, it was more about getting to know a lot of people and making a lot of friendships that, for me, eventually worked out in a really positive way. But that wasn't even really my goal back then. It was more just, I didn't really grow up anywhere near the entertainment industry. And I had like no friends and no whatever. And it was more about almost like a support group of people who are also just starting out. But the people that I befriended were incredibly talented. And right now they find themselves, I had like a small core group of friends, and they were, like right now they're senior sound at Guerrilla Games and at Spongy and at Audio Kinetic themselves. And that was kind of my core group that I was hanging with. But at that time, we were all in that same position of, how do we make it? What do we do? How do we get that first credit?
Well, how did you find those people? Like,
that was
they were really passionate about audio to be able to get their careers moving as well.
Exactly. Yeah. So first off, they were all, and I think this is important to remember, all the people that I'm mentioning right now are sound designers and not necessarily composers. And I've made a lot of wonderful composer friends along the way who are, I would say, also very crucial to supporting my career and keeping me on track, both in terms of technique and also even like psychologically with the philosophy of how game music works and all that stuff. But it was just as important to befriend people who are not just other people on exactly your side of the industry. For me, that was very important, part because I felt like I could learn a lot more from them, and part because another reality is that you're probably going to be hired by an audio lead, an audio director, or something like that. And sometimes there are other composers, sometimes not. It just depends, but it's just nice to have that diversity of friendships. The way that we met was, one of them, Damien Kaspauer, who a lot of people know, over at Audio Kinetic right now, he emailed a small indie dev team that I was working with. And I just got this email forwarded to me and from the project lead, who was so confused. He's like, I think this guy wants to do our sound design. So I'm like, okay. So I open this email. I'm going to embarrass Damien real quick. I open this email and it's the most inscrutable, like rambling, several like pages and pages long. It was so bizarre. And it started, I remember the first sentence it read, and no hello, no dear game developer. No, none of that. Instead, it starts off, the seeds were planted early on, and I learned to love the noise. That was the first sentence of this email. And we were like, what? It's just like, hire this man. He's going places. And we actually got to be really close. You know, we hadn't met yet, but just all over the internet. You know, this is like 2005, maybe, long time ago. And later on that year, he said, hey, there's this GDC thing, Game Developers Conference. I'm going. I've got some friends going. You should go too. And you know, I did some research and scratched, you know, whatever monies that I could together, and I made it out there. And I also remember that there was like a contest, the Game Audio Network Guild, they still do. They have this yearly contest. It's like students and apprentices and whatnot, where they give like some sort of a theme and they say, all right, everyone write like a 1-minute piece based on this idea or concept. So they had that contest, and I happened to have, I won it for music, but another friend of Damien's, who I guess he was roommates with for GDC, won it for sound design. And we was like, oh, we definitely have to stick together and hang out, share some ideas. And Karsten Royan and I kind of became really good friends from that point on. He's at Bungie now. We worked together 2 years ago, last year, I guess, on the Destiny 2 Forsaken. Mm-hmm. He was the senior sound designer for it, and I wrote some of the small part of the music, like additional music and stuff for it. And yeah, you know, it's just real funny, man. Like these relationships that you make a million years ago, they pretty much always come back in some way. And if not like, oh, they got me the gig, then at least you've learned something from that relationship. You've made a connection. Maybe they can introduce you to someone else. You know, like in Damien's case, only 3 years after that, I think, he was then working for Bay Area Sound because he probably wrote them a similarly weird email. and they were like, I don't know who this is, but we need to hire this guy right now. And he got an audio implementation job with them. And he ended up getting contracted to work at LucasArts on their new audio engine that they were developing for Indiana Jones Staff of Kings and later Star Wars The Force Unleashed. And eventually they got to a point where they needed some help with music editing and music assistant type stuff. And Damien said, hey, why don't you talk to this Wilbert guy? And that's basically how I got the gig. So again, like I wasn't showing up to conferences expecting a gig right then and there and harassing all the audio directors or anything like that. It was
That's a good point.
Yeah, I just made friends who I jived with, and it didn't matter what level or whatever they were. It was more like, well, we get along, and eventually with a little patience, it ended up being greatly beneficial to all of us.
Mm-hmm. So how did you approach people at GDC? What was your strategy?
You know, it probably wasn't very good because, again, I'd never been in the entertainment industry before, and I never had any kind of like assistantships or anything like that. And I was also quite shy. I still am. People don't realize it, but I am. And so I probably didn't do a great job of following up or anything like that, or talking to everyone. I tried my best, but it takes practice. You know, it takes years and years to develop that skill. And it is a skill. That's why they call it social skills. It's not something that you're just, born with. But I would say that once I kind of got my footing and confidence and whatnot up, and this is like years and years after, probably like even after I was working at LucasArts for some amount of time, then it's like, oh, okay, I can sort of handle myself. You know, I would go to events in and outside of audio at GDC. Some of my best friends in the industry have nothing whatsoever to do with audio. They're level designers, engineers, artists, visual artists, especially, environment artists and whatnot. Because again, I like that breadth and diversity of experience. And honestly, I just love how games are put together. It's absolutely fascinating to me. This is what's keeping me in the industry, is that I'll play a game and I'll see how gorgeous the graphics are, and whatever new novel techniques that they develop for it, either graphically or in terms of gameplay technology. And that's what really fascinates me. And so I guess that's sort of facilitated me stepping out of just only talking to other musicians, but instead having great friendships with people all across the board.
Okay, so I had a question about composers starting out their career. So you didn't really mention this before, but like some composers may have a part-time job while they're trying to get composing gigs. Is that something that you personally did, or know other people that have done that? And I guess, how do you get out of that? Because it's almost like a trap, right? You have a part-time job that may end up, you may get stuck there. You can't get out. So I don't know. Do you have any tips and tricks for how you manage your early career to be able to transition from working a part-time job, trying to get contracts, trying to get your foot in the door? Or is it something that you just have to be all in or nothing? Like, how is your...
I don't quite believe in the whole all in or nothing. Because think about it, you need a certain amount of money to get by, right? I mean, not even just talking about the music stuff, but like, you need to pay rent, you need to like eat, you need, whatever. Some people are, fortunate enough that like maybe they can like live with their parents or like whatever, but nonetheless, you need some source of income. And as far as being, I never really felt trapped at any of the part-time jobs that I had, but they were really crappy part-time jobs. So it wasn't like, oh no, I can't leave stacking books at the library, like that's such a gainful career. And it's just, whatever, they'd understand. We were young, whatever. But that said, if you are more advanced in age when you're starting out, it can be quite difficult, actually. It can be very difficult. And at that point, hopefully you have accumulated enough wealth that you're saving or investing or whatever, that, well, number one, your money can make money for you and you're moving things around so that it does, and you're keeping your expenses low and all that. But number two, that you can have the freedom to dedicate the time that is necessary. I mean, in my case, the only reason I quit my like temp jobs or whatever was because I just had a ridiculously demanding film director that I was working with. I mean, like calling me like 7 times a day, like that level of,
Wow.
What are you doing? I'm at work right now. You can't just call me. And it was a terrible film anyway. So it's like, why am I? But eventually I quit the job so that I could finish this, which is maybe not the smartest thing in the world, but it worked out eventually. So, whatever. But I'll also say that having some sort of a diversification of your income is quite important. In my case, I mean, I know a lot of people who like teach because they're quite gifted musicians, like performers. In my case, the way I've diversified, which has been quite gainful, is I founded Impact Soundworks, which is a sample developer company. Excuse me. This was way back in like 2006 or 2007, a long time ago. And it never was meant to be a commercial effort, but I created a sample library. It was like a special effects percussion kind of thing called Impact Steel, where I took different metal objects and I very deeply sampled them, which had never really been done before, with velocities, round robin, and so on, and a specially programmed effects version of it. And I showed that to some forumers like Northern Sounds WII Control or something, and they were like, "Yes, this is awesome. We want it. Sell it to us now." And so I was like, "Oh, okay, I guess." And I asked them, "How much do you want me to sell it for?" And they were like, $90. And I was like, "Oh, okay." So I did, and I set up the company, and I sold it through there. It was surprisingly successful considering how just unbelievably ghetto the whole setup was. I mean, now that we're almost 20 years later, I can reveal that it was not a very professional recording, but I had like a vision, and so I saw that through at every step and made all of the little tweaks and mixing magic to make it sound actually quite good. I still use it today. But anyway, so I did that, and then a friend of mine, Andrew Aversa, was like, "Oh yeah, this sample library thing sounds like a good idea. Why don't we make another one? And can I join in?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure." And long story short, he kind of grew Impact Soundworks to be what it is now, which is like one of the leading developers. And I've stepped down a long time ago, back when I was at Lucas, because I just didn't have the time for it. But getting that quarterly check has been quite helpful for my career, especially after so I was at LucasArts for like 5 years, and then the Disney buyout, so they laid off all the staff, and having that extra paycheck quarterly was super helpful. I know a lot of other composers basically have the same thing, but with licensed music. So they'll put their music out in music libraries. I don't know too much about that practice personally, but I do know that it can be a great way to make sure that you're still getting paid even when you're not, like when you're between gigs or whatever.
So I know the Call of Duty World War II score was all in the one project file. You've mentioned that in another interview. So what sort of hardware do you have to run that? Like how many PCs do you run, and that type of stuff?
You know, once again, I got to say, I'm not contrarian just for the sake of being contrarian. It's just that I feel like I started doing things one way, and then everyone in Hollywood was kind of doing things another way, and it just sort of missed. But I guess to answer the question, no, I just have one PC. Mm-hmm. It's just one. It's not, here, I can pull up my specs real quick. Mm-hmm. It's not super special awesome. It's an i7, 3.2 gigahertz, mm-hmm. 64 gigs of RAM, which is pretty mm-hmm. decent, but not amazing. Mm-hmm. And that's it. You know, I just run this one PC, an RME babyface interface, mm-hmm. and that's all I got. I don't have any like outboard mixing gear or anything like that. I do have synthesizers, which I really love working with, but mm-hmm. That's pretty much it as far as the external gear. I don't do any of like the crazy stuff that you see, like, look at our amazing studio. I've never been that guy. Mm-hmm. And I don't. No, but really
it's quite good to know that like this information, because like everybody kind of thinks you might need multiple PCs to run like these huge templates. But I guess in your case, you don't really need it. So why would you bother?
Yeah, I mean, I'm rather efficient with how I put things mm-hmm. together. Like I don't do the whole like, oh yeah, load a big monstrous mm-hmm. key switch based thing, and then you have mm-hmm. like every single articulation. Mm-hmm. It's just like, no, I'm going to load the articulations that I actually want. Mm-hmm. And after a number of projects, it's kind of congealed into like mm-hmm. this is the sustained strings articulations that mm-hmm. I need, and then here's the short strings articulations that mm-hmm. I need, and that's it. I'm not going to load like the other 17 different legatos that are in East-West mm-hmm. Hollywood, because I just don't use them anyway, so why bother? Mm-hmm. And I only load like at most 2 microphones for any of those East-West mm-hmm. samples as well. And usually, well, for the most part, just the one, because guess what? It sounds good. So mm-hmm. why, you know?
Yeah.
And then, you know, I just kind of use my ears in terms of mixing. I did a whole lecture at GDC about how I work with reverb and sample realism and stuff. It might take a little too long to get into, but I base my mixes and reverbs and whatnot on real world rather than impressionistically saying like, oh, this needs more reverb, this needs less. Mm-hmm. Instead, the mix amounts of like how much I send to an IR are based on the loudness of the instrument rather than how wet or dry I want them. So if an instrument is rather quiet in real life, like let's say a bassoon or something, mm-hmm. Well, you're not going to hear it in the distant, like far away microphones because it's just too quiet. The trumpets and trombones are going to overblow it. But you will hear more of it in the sectional overheads because the mix engineer would probably turn it up. And then you might hear a little bit of close mic as well, not really for volume, but just for definition. I've sort of based my template around that, and that's how I've been able to get away with not having to load a cajillion extra samples for the different mic sets, and everything kind of gels together really nicely as a result. Right now, the big, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to. Yeah, well, the project I'm working on right now, I can't say what it is, but it's likely my biggest project file to date in terms of depth. So it's about 690 tracks deep, which is a huge pain. But I mean, thank goodness for screen sets, right? But and then it's also another one of those projects where I have the whole score in just the one file. Yeah.
Do you ever run out of RAM and like have to manage things? Like,
no, RAM is not the issue.
Okay.
Because I have 64 gigs and it's only ever gotten up to like 35 gigabytes of use. The thing I'm running up against right now is CPU. It hovers around 40 to 60% on this project file, which is terrifying. But I mean, shouts out to Reaper. Reaper just kind of handled it, and it's able to just chug along. And I'm just sitting here watching my PC, just crossing my fingers every time I write a new cue for this damn score. You know.
So for someone who's never actually had a whole score in the one project file, how do you manage from going from one cue to the next? Because I know, like with many cues, you'll be doing automation. You'll end on a certain point. How do you bring everything back up to where it needs to be? Because if you set everything to zero again, it's obviously going to be wrong, because you might have certain instruments at say minus 12 dB or something like that. So how do you actually, do you have any tips and tricks for going from one cue to the next and just setting up like things that like you take for granted now, but if someone was going to attempt this, what techniques should they be doing and how would you make it all work?
Yeah, I mean, well, there's sort of two things that you're referring to. One of them, in terms of the DAW's automation, I'm not sure if this is like every DAW has this or what, but Reaper has a thing where it's like, okay, I've set the volume level on the mixing page, and this is where the actual slider is. But then I also have like a volume automation that's just going wherever. And in Reaper, you can make those independent of each other. So I can just say, yeah, okay, this whole instrument is at minus 3 dB, but my automation line is doing, you know, whatever it wants. You can do that. And it's a fairly simple, like if you really need it to be, I mean, first of all, it's weird not to have that automation line zeroed out. You'd have to have a pretty good reason why you didn't just zero this out and then move the main slider. But if for whatever reason that's the case, then you just have to remember to reset it at the end of each cue. And cues are kind of in these regions so that you can easily see where one starts and ends and whatnot. So it's not too hard to deal with that. But then the other part of it is in MIDI, like MIDI CCs.
Yeah.
And you just have to be good about resetting your controllers. That's really all there is to it. And even if I didn't have everything in one project file, resetting the controllers is still very good practice, because you never know, like maybe you're starting to, I don't know, play it back from halfway through the piece. Well, Reaper has a thing now where it looks previously and tries to guess at what the what each CC, let's try again, guess where each CC should be. So if you set it to like 64 way back here and you didn't reset it over here, then it'll be like, oh, it should probably be at 64. So let's go from there. But I don't think most DAWs have that. And even still, I'll like to reset at the beginning of each clip just to make sure that there's no surprises or sudden jumps or anything like that.
So do you have any overall composing tips, like setting keys, setting the different keys, setting structure, setting tempo, the pacing? Is it something that you decide before you write a cue, or is it something that you'll decide as you're writing? Just interested to know how you actually put together your music.
Yeah, absolutely. Apparently it's weird that I do this, but I actually do a lot of sketching before going into the PC. I mean, for me, as you might imagine, with all the stuff that I've just mentioned, the PC part is like very laborious and kind of a pain. It can be fun, but it's usually like not. And so for me, I like to spend as much time as possible in the sketching, the sketching phase. And this starts even before I put notes on it. Like, I mean, yeah, I have the actual, paper sketches and whatnot, but even before I go there, I like to have some sort of a concept that I've nailed down for what is going to happen more generally. And there's a couple ways I do this. First off, I always like to do it in text form. So I'll open maybe like notepad.exe or something, like just simple text editor, and just brainstorm ideas. They don't have to be musical ideas. It can be just adjectives. Things like this should sound blue and gray, or this should sound aggressive, but also, whatever. And I'll just have, line by line, all these different concepts. And then eventually, quite naturally, actually, I'll start to think about the form, like how should it start? Where should it go from there? What should happen next? But in broad terms. I mean, literally, I'm working on a thing right now. I can't say what it is, but it's for the indie game I'm working on, which is called Anew: The Distant Light.
Yep.
And it's some pieces that I'm writing for it now. And yeah, I use this text file to describe what's happening in the level, and then I'll say things like, yes, start with 3 plucks or clangs or stings or something, and high strings, swirly effects, and then the swirliness begins as the high brass swells and percussion. Whatever. There's no notes, but it gives you can kind of tell what's going to happen. And then later on, I do have notes here, but it's in text. So I'll just say like E6 plus C sharp, and then D plus C, and then later on I can figure out what that actually looks like, and then ultimately what it sounds like. But this gives me a great sort of starting point to then later on put onto paper. Or honestly, with this, some of these are so simple that I may just dive right into into Reaper and just do it. But it's good that I have this all planned out, because now, like it's like 3 pieces that sort of tie into each other at different parts of the game, and I know where it ends, and I can kind of work towards there as I'm writing, even from the very start. So that's the way I like to do it, and I'm, I guess, more traditional than most composers tend to be these days. So yeah, there is a lot of benefit to doing this with, say, the orchestra. But I've even started to do this with synth sounds. Like in my scores, I'll describe the synth sounds that I want for, like if I'm doing a more modern production. And I've kind of come up with my own vocabulary for what to do with each of the different synth features and synth knobs and things like that, so that it can work as a, on paper sketch. And it's worked really well. It's worked very solidly for the other game that I'm working on, which is a lot more synth heavy than anything else I've worked on before.
What do you continually do to improve your skills as a composer?
That's a great question. I mean, I think it's important to not write the same score twice, if you know what I mean. And it's a danger, because we're all out here in this vast ocean, and in my case especially, it took me so long to get anywhere in my career. I've been writing game music for longer than I've not been writing game music, like a lot longer actually, ever since I was maybe 13 years old. And when you finally get that bit of success, 15 minutes of fame, whatever, it's very tempting to be like, okay, that's what worked. Let's just do that again and again and again. And to some degree, that's what like the industry or whatever wants you to do, but you'll just get burned out so quickly with that mentality. I know I would. I mean, some people might like it, that's great, but like, I like to try different things every time. So that's part of why, like I mentioned, I'm using a lot of synthesis nowadays. I'm using a lot of hardware synths as well as software and FM especially, and learning a lot of these things that I really hadn't used before, say like 3 years ago, because it's just so fresh and novel to me that kind of sparks new ideas, new concepts that I wouldn't have thought of before. The other thing that I always encourage people to do is transcription. That's actually how I learned to write in the first place. I used to, again, this is like 1999, 2000, long before MP3s were a thing. And so if you wanted to listen to your favorite piece of video game music, you had to find the MIDI file that some basement dwelling nerd had spent all week transcribing note for note. And I was one of those basement dwelling nerds that would spend all week transcribe. I would record the track onto like a cassette tape from the actual game. And then I would listen back to the little cassette and then take it down note for note. And that's how I learned how to write from all of the great 1990s, especially Japanese game music masters like Nobuo Uematsu with his Final Fantasy scores and Yasunori Mitsuda with Chrono Cross Trigger and Xenogears. That's really, all those transcription is how I figured out not only what they were doing, but why they did it that way. And it's continued since then. I mean, when I was learning how to write Star Wars scores, I would transcribe tons of John Williams's music, and it was immensely helpful. Again, for understanding how the harmony and the orchestration were put together, and even especially the rhythm. And that's kind of how that all came together. I know Gordy Hab also does the same thing, especially when he was just starting to do the whole Star Wars thing years and years ago. He would do transcriptions as well, and it's a great way to learn. Almost before every single project I do some kind of a transcription to just sort of understand, well, what is it that, what can I learn completely new that I haven't done at all before, or dive deeper into something that I had been doing. I've done lots of transcriptions of Bulgarian folk music, which I really love. That's where a lot of my harmony comes from. Outside of anything vocal or anything like that, but even in orchestration, a lot of my harmony is based on that idiom. Before I did Mortal Kombat, I did transcriptions of taiko drum ensembles, because I figured, well, I don't want to go into this Mortal Kombat thing and have inauthentic Hollywood lame kind of taiko. I want it to actually sound as close as I can get to the real thing whenever I use anything like that. So that's really been a major force for my own development. And then lastly, another thing that I kind of recommend, which maybe not everyone needs to do this, but I certainly did, was to try to focus on one thing at a time in your development, rather than being overwhelmed by like, oh, I heard this amazing score and it was so good and everything and I suck and whatever. But like, instead just be like, okay, this year I'm going to focus on melody. I'd gone through college, the whole art music thing, and I learned all of these different orchestration techniques. I'd studied Stravinsky on my own, like outside of class, and all this stuff for texture. But in doing so, I won't say that I lost my sense of melody, but that was kind of by the wayside for a while. And then, the real world hit, and it was like, hey, you should probably learn how to write a tune, right? That would probably be a good idea. So as I was working my little bullshit library jobs and whatnot, every single morning I would write something. I called it shower melodies, was like the folder that I kept in my little laptop. And every single morning I would write something. It didn't have to be good at all. It just had to be. And I'd flesh it out and then go off to work every single day for that year. And in doing so, I learned so much about melody and how things really work under the hood that you probably wouldn't notice as a passive observer. But if you're actively studying like that every single day, you'll eventually put two and two together and develop your own style for how you create melody and whatnot. Later on, I did the same with different things. Like harmonically, I just got bored of how I was doing harmony, so I came up with something new and tried to dive deep into that. Right now, again, it's the synthesis that I'm doing a lot more of now than I ever have before. And it's just a great way to not only develop, but also kind of keep yourself humble, keep yourself fresh and make sure that you're constantly evolving rather than pumping out the same score over and over and over again.
Do you do a lot of plug-in Like, do you study much about plugins and mixing and mastering,
Hmm.
as well as the compositional side of things?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, like, I could look it up now, but the preposterous numbers of plugins, which is probably why Reaper gets up to like 50%. You know, the dangerous thing Reaper does, by the way, is you can put plugins on individual audio clips, and you know, it's good to learn how to just set something and just let it go. Just be like, hey, I'm going to commit to this signal path. I'm going to commit to this whatever. That's good practice, but in reality, I'm definitely not that guy. I'm still like, oh, what if I did it wrong? I don't know. What do I do? You know. So I'll keep things on, and you know, it can be a simple EQ, but when you have like 1,000 of them, it can really add up very quickly. But yeah, I use tons and tons of effects processing plugins, not to mention Contact and Play and whatnot. I actually do a lot of sound design in Contact, musical sound design, because it gives more. It's actually a lot more powerful than people realize. I think a lot of people just buy whatever commercial sample library and they kind of just hit MIDI notes and then they're like, cool, done. But you can be very creative in that program. So I do a lot with that. As far as mixing goes, I haven't. I mean, my whole mix philosophy with orchestra, not other stuff, but with the orchestra itself is don't. Like I don't mix at all, really. Instead, I set up a template where everything is where it should be, and it's literally impossible for me to have a clarinet be too loud. It's literally impossible because the way it's set up, it's only got so much volume that I can give it, and then once I've hit that, it's like, hey, if you can't hear it, fix the orchestration. And that's how I've approached every mix issue, is with orchestration rather than grabbing most people would maybe like turn the volume up or like grab a compressor or whatever. And you know, you can do that. That's great, I guess. But when you add up all of those compromises one after the other, it loses its realism very quickly. So I guess my answer is that I don't mix until okay. So I have a tendency to say something and sound dogmatic, but then reveal that I don't exactly do it this way. I do some mixing if I'm doing like a soundtrack release, like for Mortal Kombat 11 Aftermath. I did the mix and the master for that, and I did sort of what you might call a stem master, where like I have all of the brass in one stem, all the strings, all the winds and whatnot, and there was some level of like analog-esque mixing. I think I used BX Console, and it's just touching the analog a little bit to get a little bit more clarity and brightness out of everything. But it's not really, I wouldn't call that aggressive mixing like I know a lot of people do. And if it works for them, then great. That's awesome. I don't mean to downplay that. But for me personally, I like that natural sound. And in my opinion, the way to get that is to solve these problems with orchestration rather than aggressive modern mixing techniques. But only for the orchestra. For everything else, yeah, go nuts. Do whatever you like. And I love Alan Meyerson. He's probably my favorite mix engineer out there. And so he's done a lot of tutorials, especially in association with Waves. And you can see kind of how he puts things together. And I really like some of his techniques, as well as Dennis Sands. But Dennis Sands and Sean Murphy and John Kurlander are, just kind of some of my favorite recording engineers of all time. And so I love modeling my work after what they do.
So what are your favorite sample libraries for the orchestra?
Yeah, I use Hollywood strings for most of the string writing because it's so much more versatile, I think, than people realize. I can't imagine any better sample library out right now, especially for fast, like actiony stuff. But fast and actiony in like a realistic way. I know that there's probably better for like if you want like a trailery kind of thing where it's just sounds powerful. But as far as like I want this string section to behave the same way a more traditionally orchestrated section would, I love East West for that. For brass, it's quite a hybrid. So I use Hollywood Brass for the horn section, but trumpets are both Hollywood Brass and Sample Modeling, which is a company that does this sort of hybrid, physically modeled and sampled instruments. I use Sample Modeling for the first chair trumpet and the first chair tenor and bass trombones. And then for the other trombones, I'll use Spitfire Albion. In a very silly way. They have a patch which is horns and trombones in unison, and I just hard pan it and then stereo collapse it, so you're only hearing the trombone side, but with a little of that warmth that the horns gave to it. And when I combine that with the Sample Modeling trombones, which are a little bit harsh, it sort of evens it out. And there's a million little effects and things that I put on Sample Modeling to make it work in 3D. Once again, calling attention to the fact that I'll tell you one thing and then do the exact opposite in real life. But you know what I mean. Like it's doing. I'm a liar. I'm not even going to. Whatever. And then for percussion, it's mostly Cineperc, because again, I love Dennis Sand's recordings. And he recorded that one. I hope I'm getting the name right. That's yeah. And for winds, I mostly use Albion, Spitfire Albion, and Project Sam Woodwinds, which is out of date. They don't sell that anymore. It's a part of Symphobia, I think, right now. But I use those for like the wind sections, and then Hollywood winds for some extra stuff here and there, and a lot of solos from VSL and from 8-Dio.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the Spitfire Albion. Which Spitfire Albion? Because there's like 5 different versions, or
the very first, oldest. Okay. No, just the very
original.
First one. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Uh-huh. I'm not sure that you can buy that anymore, which is a shame. Yeah, because if I remember correctly, they did a thing where they and hey, this is their decision, and that's I totally understand why they do it this way. But they did a thing where they took the attacks of the notes and they made it like much tighter and more more clean, I guess, which is great. I mean, a lot of people, they click notes in with the mouse, and this makes it more consistent for them. So that's fantastic. But since I play things in, it sort of removes some of the human feel for me personally. Other people, they love it. And so I'm like, more power to you. I'm not going to, whatever. But for me, the old version is best.
Yeah, I know the new version, Albion 1, does have some of the legacy patches.
Oh, it does?
There. Yeah, it does
perfect.
have some of them.
That's
but
great.
It's not, But I don't think it's everything. I can't remember off the top of my head which articulations there are, but they tried to take the best of the original Albion 1 legacy version and tried to put some of it into the Albion 1. I guess you could... It's not a re-release because it's basically a new, they've recorded everything new again, but they've just added some of the legacy stuff in. So you have all the new orchestra recordings, and then they have a folder called Albion Legacy. And so you actually have some of the original stuff in there. But I know a lot of people were quite annoyed when they stopped selling Albion 1, the legacy version, because there was so much good stuff in there. So
yeah, that's I don't mean to ruffle feathers, but it's business. People, sample library companies, they do things, and it's that you have to appeal to as many people as possible, right? And there's certain creative decisions that are going to benefit a lot of people, but aren't necessarily great for someone who's in a certain situation, and that's fine. It just kind of it puts me in a weird situation, because I'll be like, hey, yeah, just use this, and I use that and that, but it's a bunch of libraries you can't even buy anymore. All the VSL stuff I use, you can't buy, because it was back in the Giga Sampler days, Opus 1 and Opus 2.
Yeah.
And then I've taken those and put them into Contact and re-edited them quite significantly. So now they sound amazing, but you can't really tell someone. And even for the string runs, I use another trick or whatever that I do is I do a lot of stuff directly with WAV files rather than using MIDI. So almost all of my percussion for like cymbals, bass drums, tam-tams, that kind of thing, piatti. It's all just wave files that I'm dragging in. And you can't really do that anymore because everyone uses compressed samples or their own proprietary whatever. And it's like, well, you know, I guess newer composers who are just starting out, they don't have the luxury of doing things the way that I do it. Unless you take the time to bounce things out to audio, which I also do when I need to. But, you know, it's just kind of the way it is. It's their decision, and more power to them.
So where do you get the audio files for the percussion? Is it stuff you record yourself, or is it from other libraries that you kind of...
I still, I actually still use a lot of Project Sam. They did Sam True Strike, I think it was called.
That's right.
And it sounds great. You know, their bass drums I used, cymbals, and I just drag the WAV files in because they're just, you can directly access them. They've probably changed it by now. They've probably patched it or something so that it uses compressed native instruments format or something. So you still can, can do that, but you would just have to painstakingly edit and re-render or whatever, everything. It's just the way it is, you know. What I was going to say though was that in Opus 2 of VSL, they had this amazing thing where they recorded a bunch of different string scales, like scale runs, quiet and loud, and every scale degree. So you could say dial up like D major, and it'll give you that D major, D to D, but then you also get E to E, F to F, G to G, all playing within the D major scale. So you just get all these different scale degrees. And what I realized is that, oh crap, I can do any scale at all, anything I want, because all I have to do is figure out just a little bit of mental calculus or whatever, like how do I transpose this and which scale degree do I use? And now I can figure that out. And that's been incredibly useful. I have a whole technique of how that works. And it's incredibly realistic, and it blends really well with the Hollywood strings now that I have it a sort of track template where I can just drag these files in and do a little bit of editing. And it's much better than when sample libraries try to do this, because I can, you know, I'm physically editing the WAV file in ways that you can't really do in real time. That preserves like the attack phase and the reverb tail and everything like that. And it's just much cleaner during the actual run. But again, unfortunately, I don't think any library like this has come out since that just lets you use the WAV files or anything like that. It's the way it is, you know.
Yeah. So we touched on some of this earlier, but do you have any advice for composers starting out in their career? You know, it's funny, like it's very difficult now because there are a lot of people trying to get in, but there's also way more games. So I don't know how it balances from when I was starting, where there was really no such thing as indie. I mean, there were indie games being made, but they were never funded, and they were never publicized in any way, and you never got paid a dime. And the only way to get any money and have any sort of a career was with the limited number of AAA or like AA, whatever you want to call it, type productions. So it was very tough to kind of break through that glass door, ivory tower, whatever. And the only way I was able to do it, like I mentioned, was those friendships, those personal friendships that lasted along the way. And that's really the only advice that I have in terms of the actual business side, getting the work and whatnot. Is it comes down to the people that you know. You know, I like to tell people that, like, I got Mortal Kombat by sending an email to someone. That's literally, same with Call of Duty. Yeah, I just sent an email to someone. But I didn't say like, hey, person I've never met before in my life and I don't know, hire me for Mortal Kombat and Call of Duty. But instead, it was, in both cases, I had a coworker that I'd worked with previously, and we had a great relationship, and we kept in touch. And they had worked on Mortal Kombat 10 or on
Advanced Warfare or no, Modern, whatever, it doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
They had worked on a previous game from that developer. And I asked them, hey, can you introduce me to the audio director? And they did. And, I don't know what they wrote, but it was probably positive. And then later on, we met up at GDC or wherever. And, we had a bunch of different conversations. But once we both realized that we were in alignment in terms of like the aesthetic we wanted to bring to it, like for Mortal Kombat, it was a little easier because I've been a Mortal Kombat fan since I was like 12. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous how much I love Mortal Kombat. But, we were in alignment there. And the audio director is also a Mortal Kombat composer. So he just completely gets it. And he's even giving me advice on the phone when I was doing my demo for it of like, it's so easy. You just have percussion and octatonic mode. You'll do fine. He's just telling me like the secret or whatever. And then with Call of Duty, we commiserated on just how hard it is to put music into an FPS game. It's exceptionally difficult. And I'd just gone through this at LucasArts with Star Wars First Assault, which was unfortunately a canceled title. But it was a challenge of like, well, how do you get, like, this is a franchise that needs music. How do I get that in there without betraying, without screwing up the soundscape and making it hard for them to hear the gunfire, the footsteps, and all these things that are gameplay significant. And the audio director had just gone through that same problem on Call of Duty. And we each talked about our solutions, like, well, how can we, deal with that? And it was almost like I was already a part of the team long before I was actually hired. But it was that sort of face-to-face time that really, I guess, gave them trust in contacting me and whatnot. But I wouldn't have even had that opportunity were it not for me reaching out to my friend who then reached out to this person. And so I guess, like, once again, it's all about having those friendships of people who are not necessarily in a position to hire you directly, but they're quite talented, and you get along with them incredibly well. It almost doesn't matter what their status or whatever is. It's always beneficial to make those friendships.
So what did you do on Call of Duty to actually balance the sound effects with the music? Like, what was some of the techniques that you used to actually?
So first off, I realized that game music is only good if you can hear it. And it's funny, man, like, there's so much amazing writing out there, and no one, I almost feel bad for people putting like so much effort into these things that no one's going to hear because they're so busy trying to not die. And also voiceover is going crazy and sound design is, dialed to 11 or whatnot. So it's like, all right, so is that really the place that you want to put your incredibly elaborate orchestration or whatever? But what I did was I said, all right, we have the orchestra, but why don't we take things out of the orchestra? Things that, number one, would make it sound too dated and kind of not relatable. Or number two, things that would interfere with the sound design. So I took out most of the percussion section, actually. And especially there's no snare drums, which probably sounded weird for like a World War II game not to have snare drums, but we very quickly realized that a snare drum is just a gunshot. They're the same sound, especially when you're dealing with these very ballistic historical weapons. So I took them out. I took out the mallets because, again, that hard transient was just too much, and it would confuse with the soundscape and the UI and whatnot. And then I didn't use like big epic trailery drums. Instead, I did use big drums, but they were used very, very quietly and sparingly. Excuse me. And I didn't have the synth ARPs and whatnot that you would expect from a Call of Duty modern title. Because again, I wanted to preserve that historical thing. We walked this weird tightrope between like not too historical and not too modern to get exactly in the middle. But I did all that. And whenever I would write a piece of music, I would load up some video, not even of this game, but actually of Call of Duty 2 on PlayStation 2. I had this one clip of your like going from bunker to bunker or something that had no music and very chaotic soundscape. And I was like, yes, this is perfect. If my music can be heard and, understood against that, then you're good. And whenever I heard any musical element that was like too loud or popped out of the mix, I took it out. And if ever there was something that was not audible, I took that out too, because I was just like, what's the point, And in the end, you got this situation where the music blends so well with the sound design in that game that they were able to turn the music up very loud. Like if you listen to the music in World War II versus almost any other FPS, it's turned up really loudly, even though the actual content is relatively quiet, because I don't use big synths and the orchestra is a little smaller and closer mic'd than normal. And I think that's why it was a little bit successful in terms of people appreciating the scores, because they could hear it. Whereas, in other scores, composers do these brilliant hybrid things that sound so great and perfect, immaculate mix and all these different elements, but you can't hear it. So it's like no one knows. They're busy trying to not die,
Yeah.
And,
it's a great soundtrack by itself with the game.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. I'm glad that people are listening to these scores on their own, because in isolation, man, I won't name names because I don't want to, whatever, but like there's some scores out there that it's like, I wish I heard it like this in the actual game, maybe compromise something in the sound design, but it's an unwinnable fight. And, what do you do?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for the interview, Wilbert. It's been awesome speaking to you, man.
Absolutely.
So where can people find you online? Do you have social networks that you connect?
My site is rogetmusic.com, but you'll find me on Twitter at Wilbert Roget, or on Facebook, Facebook.com/Roget Music, my artist page.
Okay, well, thank you.
Yeah,
Awesome
thanks for having me.
man.
Yeah, take care.